Hello, and welcome to the APEX webinar, Challenges and Opportunities in Supply Chain Management, Collaboration, Costing, and Going Global, with Stan Griffis and Bixby Cooper. My name is Jennifer Storelli, Associate Editor at APEX. Please note this presentation is being recorded and will be available at apex.org/online events starting early next week. Before we begin, I'd like to run through a few details. At the end of the presentation, we will save time for a question and answer session. If you look at the right toolbar on your screen, you'll see a questions box. To ask your question at any time during the presentation, simply type it in the box and click send. Should you experience any technical difficulties during today's broadcast, please call GoToWebinar Tech Support at 1-805-617-7000. Again, that's 1-805-617-7000. This presentation will last approximately 54 minutes plus the Q&A session. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today.
Welcome everyone to the webinar. Today's topic is challenges and opportunities in supply chain management. Some discussion about collaboration, costing, and going global. This is a joint project between APEX and Michigan State University. And the project is called Beyond the Horizons. On the webinar today, we've got two faculty members from Michigan State University. The first of them is Bixby Cooper. As you can see here, Bix is an associate professor here in the Eli Broad College of Business at Michigan State. You've got his contact information here. The voice you're hearing right now is me. My name is Stan Griffis. I'm also here at the Eli Broad College of Business at Michigan State. And you've also got my contact information. And at any point after the webinar is complete, if you have an interest in contacting either Bix or myself for follow-on discussion or anything as it relates to this topic, you've got those numbers and emails that you can go ahead and reach out to us if you would like. As far as the topics we'll be covering today, we've got a little bit of an agenda here for you, the structure of the webinar. At the outset, we're going to talk to you about what Beyond the Horizon, the project is, this joint venture between Michigan State and APEX. We'll just give you a kind of a high-level view of what that looks like. And then we're going to spend the bulk of our time talking about some findings that have come out of the study to date. We've got quite a bit of information about how we've gone about the study and some of the information that's coming from that. We'll break that into three real main areas. We're going to talk some about integration and collaboration. We've got a section on global supply chains, and then we've got some interesting stuff that we're learning about costing, and so we'll cover that with you as well. So that will go about 50 minutes, and then at the end of that, we've got 20 minutes set aside for some Q&A. So if you have questions as the webinar is going on, go ahead and type those in. We've got an administrator taking care of pulling all those in for us, and so we can go ahead and answer those at the end of the webinar in this Q&A session. So about Beyond the Horizon, as I mentioned, it's a joint venture between APEX and Michigan State University. And when you see this logo here, it's really just representing that the content that you're seeing is coming out of that study between those two organizations. One of the things that has emerged out of this research, and it's kind of a backdrop, if you will, against today's discussion, is something that we call the bridge model, a visualization of which you see here on the screen. And what the bridge model tries to do is it tries to look for organizations that currently have an intent to get to some point in space, a realization. It starts to look at what features, what things need to be going on to get to the realization of a strategy, a goal, whatever it might be. And what you see with the bridge is we've got our roadbed, which is, to use the car analogy, where we would actually operate. But supporting that is a set of these bridge supports. And if you go from the left to the right of the model, we think that the bridge builds in this way, and that given a set of internal and external drivers, what is my corporate culture like? What is my external environment look like? A number of different features like this. What do they do as far as setting up what my bridge looks like, the direction that it goes in, things of this nature. And then the next stage, if you will, is that how we achieve those strategies, how we pursue those goals is somewhat supported by the structure we have in our organization, the strategy that we've actually established for ourselves, and then what those practices are, the activities and things of this nature that we engage in on a day-to-day basis within the organization. And that in this way, these are formed into sets of capabilities, things that we are able to accomplish towards the pursuit of a strategy or goal. And so that strategy, that structure, those practices give us a set number of capabilities that we might then use. We may be able to design a product in a short period of time. We may have skill at marketing things. We may have a capability to develop a supplier base. And so these capabilities give us tools in the bag, if you will, towards achieving some end. And then ultimately we are seeing in our research that sets of capabilities are gathered in together to form what we're calling competencies. And so it's one thing to be able to hire people, it's another thing to be able to develop a supplier base, but if you become extremely competent in certain areas, you start to use a blending of your capabilities together, you can create competencies to then accomplish even more. And so not only are you able to hire people, but you have a competency in retaining the best talent, developing them for middle management on up to senior leadership, examples like this. And so the bridge model really just looks at these factors, starting again on the left from what are those drivers that cause us to be in a certain area, what's the structure, what's our strategy, what things are we good at that we can start to form these capabilities and ultimately competencies to get us across this span between intent and realization.
Hello everyone, this is Bixby Cooper, and I'm just going to describe briefly a little bit more about the Beyond the Horizons project. There are really three key questions that we're trying to answer in this project. First, simply deals with how are some organizations being able to use supply chain management as a strategic asset in their firm. And we spend a lot of time talking to people about what are the emerging trends in their organizations that they think will shape the future of supply chain management. And then most critically, why are some firms more successful with strategic supply chain management than other firms? Even though the companies seem to have the same tools, the same systems, and the same practices, as the bridge model suggests, some companies are able to really use those tools and systems and practices to develop competencies that other firms have not been able to accomplish. As Stan's mentioned already, that this is really a team effort between Apex and Michigan State. And from Michigan State, we have a rather large team. I'm not going to introduce or read all of the names, but you can see that there are quite a few hours that have been involved in doing the interviews around the world. As far as what we've done thus far, we've conducted interviews with over 50 medium and large-size firms around the world, representing a diverse set of industries, including manufacturing, retail, as well as even some service firms. In these interviews, we've discussed some of the things that Stan described in the bridge model. What are the drivers that are leading companies to develop new approaches? That's the environment, both internal in the organization as well as external. What are the strategies and practices that they put in place? How are they measuring their performance? What is their organizational structure that leads them to develop their strategies and their strategic initiatives? And finally, what are the real goals and objectives that they are trying to accomplish?
And so for each of these interviews, the process that we used is we would tape the interview and record it so that we could reflect on it later. And then once we had the interviews taped, we actually had them transcribed, and then the team members that you saw a couple of slides ago would then use that to go through and look at each of the interviews and start to, if you will, break down the discussions into certain areas. So if someone is talking about functional strategy, you have the ability to code that passage as a functional strategy discussion, similarly with initiatives and goals and environment. And so each of those interviews were broken down into their component pieces. And then across the interviews, what it allowed us to do is when we wanted to look at a particular topic, say supply chain strategy, that allows us to cut across all the interviews and see what each of the different respondents said over each of these rather than only looking down a single interview at a time. And it allows us to start to draw some generalities, some of which is what we're going to share with you today.
So from this content analysis that Stan mentioned, today we're going to talk about 3 topics that lead us to the conclusion of why some firms succeed and others don't. And these topics are collaboration, globalization, and the things that some companies are doing today in terms of understanding cost. And Stan's going to begin with the discussion of collaboration.
Thank you, Bix. So let's start with collaboration. This isn't a new topic to supply chain management, of course, but we are hearing some themes from our talks with the companies, and we'd like to share those with you. Within the collaboration space, we found a number of interesting findings reported by our respondents, and we'll share those with you now. Specifically, we'd like to show you the results related to successes that firms are having with collaboration, some of the challenges, ways firms are leveraging their collaborative relationships, and the importance of people in making those collaborations work. Our first finding is reflected in this first quote. Essentially, collaboration works when everybody views it as a new normal, if you will. If either side is worried that they're out of the relationship at the next opportunity, it's probably not collaboration. And so, a lot like personal relationships, there needs to be a sense of investedness in each other. And we see that in this quote where they say, we're in it for the long haul, and also that we're not going to switch out simply for a lower price. Our second discussion here takes this idea a little bit further. And you can see in their quote, it's not only do we need to both be committed to the collaboration, we have to share things that, in the past, we might have worried about sharing to get to this mutual benefit. And so we'll talk more about mutuality throughout, but we're seeing that the benefit needs to flow back and forth across the relationship. And you see that here in this quote where they say, our metrics improved and their metrics improved as well. So everyone has been supportive. Well, without that sharing, without that improvement on both sides, there's going to be problems, and it's likely that you aren't going to be able to enjoy a collaborative relationship. Unfortunately, we saw that not everyone acts in mutual ways all the time, despite recognizing that it might be a good idea. Our first respondent was quite proud of the fact that they were the point of providing demand forecasting in advance of planned retail promotions. But note how limited that actually is. They perceive this low level of demand forecasting as collaboration, but I think most of us will agree that that's really the most basic level of working with a supply chain partner, letting them know what it is that you want and when. Our next respondent takes it a little bit further. They appear to understand the value to the supplier of knowing about those orders ahead of time, and they mention the ability that affords the supplier in potentially reducing their cost, but again, a fairly one-sided collaboration. The third respondent here is probably a real treat to work with, and we believe that they think they are quite collaborative. I mean, look at their quote. We not only approach our suppliers with more accurate order information. Well, I guess my question would be weren't you always providing accurate information in this way? But then we next see the respondent declare victory because their suppliers respond to their on-site quality checks. They say, quote, we also perform quality and quantity checks at our suppliers' sites. Such a process has made our suppliers work harder to cooperate with us. Again, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound very collaborative. It sounds a little bit more like they're looking over the supplier's shoulder and checking their work rather than working side by side with them to improve the processes that could result in a better ultimate outcome. As it relates to early supplier involvement, this is just one of a group of responses that discuss this issue. The value of early involvement by suppliers really did come through in a lot of our interviews. This takes some, if you will, next level commitment to achieve. Letting your supplier in early supposes that they'll be getting that business from you. And so collaboration has to be in play. And when it is, and we'll see this in a couple other places, the benefits can be dramatic. Regarding our people, it was apparent in talking with the company that some molds need to be broken. Standard approaches need to change to become more collaborative. In this quote, the respondent says, "We had to help raise the awareness and importance to our people. Every time we engage with our suppliers, building a strong relationship is a win." That's a different, more long-term mentality, and it isn't the way most of us were raised in the supply chain business. Within the collaboration space, we heard a bit about the external elements of collaboration, and so let's see what people are saying there. This one shouldn't be a surprise, especially given we all have personal relationships to manage. Now, companies are different for sure, so scale may change, but at the end of it, and the research supports this, there's a limit to how many relationships a person or an organization can really handle. You're probably really tight with a limited few friends, close with a larger group, and acquaintances with a larger group still, but time and energy and resources to make everybody feel like number one or number two or number three, well, it just isn't there. And so the respondent reflects this. They say, you can't integrate with everybody, maybe 50 to 100 companies. And so obviously this respondent comes from a pretty large organization to be able to manage that big of a group. But nonetheless, the point is made, and that is that I can't integrate with everybody. With regard to collaboration, merely being a potential customer isn't always enough to get your desired supplier's attention, or their business for that matter. This first respondent's company isn't huge, but it's significantly large. But nonetheless, they're working to become that customer of choice. I don't want to be, as they say here, that pain in the neck to those potential suppliers. Second quote here is from the same company, and so they're trying to be there for that supplier more than just an on-time payment source, if you will. And so they appear to be more collaborative. They say, quote, "I struggle with you when it's struggling time. I have success with you when it's success time." And this is a more involved collaboration. Actually, it sounds a little bit like marriage vows, doesn't it? In sickness and in health. This company, and I'm not suggesting something grander than it is, they're looking at their suppliers in a very long-term way. Essentially, we'll succeed together and we'll suffer together. Some of our respondents voice that these bidirectional collaborative abilities are something that they're trying to find in future supply chain partners. This quote here, this company has shifted from a cost-only focus, and we'll hear more about costing from Bix here in a couple of minutes, to more about finding those partners that will and can collaborate and can bring innovations to their product or service offering, yet also have the ability to help them with that long-term cost that we all care about. Another interesting thing we heard from the companies as we talked about external collaboration was this topic of the competition. And so an interesting finding, it shows that even when we get working together, the day-to-day can get in the way of the long-term in a collaboration. Look at what this respondent is saying. They say, quote, "I'm envious of the Japanese philosophy where there's shared accountability, belief, passion, and pride in being world-class. But they're experiencing challenges that prevent this focus." And they say, quote, "Ours is a culture where we either don't trust one another or we're not aligned universally with what our objectives should be. We're still islands. We train the guns on each other rather than train the guns on the competition." This speaks to an important issue. If we don't keep everyone focused on what the goal at hand is, we risk turning on ourselves rather than concentrating on that overall objective. Our last observation in the collaboration space has to do with being open to expert opinion. This first company here, a manufacturer, realized that their collaboration with their suppliers wasn't netting the outcomes that they'd expected. And upon reflection, they realized the issue was due to them and not the supplier. So once they gave the supplier some more freedom to innovate, big benefits resulted. That's more of an evolved, if you will, approach than a lot of us are comfortable with being with our suppliers. Here's a different firm. It's larger than our first one, and they also reported that sometimes they needed to swallow their pride and accept that their supply chain partners were able to help make both of them better. taking those drawings and thrusting them on the supplier without giving them an opportunity to impart some of their knowledge onto that product or that process, it denies you as the customer the benefit of the knowledge base of that supplier. This last company really put a fine edge on it. They said, you know, we threw it over the wall and then things didn't go well. And so we'd rework it and we'd throw it over the wall again. Doesn't really work, but there's hope, and they report this. And they say, you know, we needed a lot more input from our supply chain. We want to involve them very closely, and that's a big change for our organizations. Now, we're not saying that this is easy, because it isn't, but the value's there. If you can accomplish the hard work and make it possible and become more collaborative, you can affect these types of changes and get to the point where you start to have these values come back out of the system. Okay, enough about collaboration. We've also got some things we'd like to share with you about globalization. And within the globalization space, we'd like to talk to you about the following topics. We're going to talk about non-US growth, something that we call taxes, 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 and that should probably sound a little bit like the old realtor advice on property of location, location, location. That's no accident. And then some thoughts on complexity, as well as the role of mergers and acquisitions in globalization. So first off, just to frame the globalization topic, we've got a quote from one of our respondents that captures what we heard from many of the companies. And it's really not a big surprise, but as the respondent states, the numbers are going to win out. They say there are 350 million Americans and billions of people outside the United States. You don't have to be a brain surgeon to figure out that's where there's more business to be had. Essentially, if you want to grow your numbers, if you want to have increases in revenue, you've got to look to where the people are. And globally, you've got to look to where the concentrations of populations are. And that's going to be in certain regions of the world. So to talk more about globalization, I'm going to throw it back to Bixby Cooper.
One of the driving forces for a lot of companies in terms of why they globalize, where they're going to locate, and how they're going to structure their supply chains has to do with the basic issue of taxes. They look at their domestic tax structure and tax structures in other countries. They see opportunities and they see threats that lead them to make certain operational decisions, particularly with respect to location. This first quote makes a compelling case for a company here in the U.S. that in order to increase earnings per share or shareholder wealth, U.S. tax policy actually encourages them and incentivizes them to make investments outside the United States. This isn't just a U.S. concern, though. This quote from a major European organization gives a little bit more detail on the point and shows how tax structures may lead a company to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do and would seem illogical. In this case, the company makes a product in one country, ships it to another country, and finally ships it back to a customer located in the country where the product was actually manufactured. It's not very likely that any supply chain executive would recommend doing this, except for the fact that tax regulations exist relative to his firm's products, which encourage him to do so. Finally, this third quote points out that regulations can be quite complex. And if you want to reap the benefits of playing the tax game, you really need to understand what needs to be done and what needs to be moved. This firm found that to be considered substantive from a tax standpoint, a lot of activities had to be moved to another country. So the basic point is that tax policies around the world are driving supply chain network decisions. It's no surprise that globalization obviously brings a lot of complexity to an organization, and a lot of that complexity revolves around supply chain. We're going to take a brief look at three of the sources of that complexity and then some of the ways that supply chain executives are coping with it. There's such extreme variance across countries in terms of customs requirements, customs clearance, and duty structures that firms have to stay on top of. Brazil came up frequently in the interviews, but not just Brazil, several Asian and African countries as well. This interviewee pointed out that those requirements, coupled with the tax issues, combined to increase product prices in his situation to a point that may put them out of the price point range that customers can actually afford. So if you want to do business in those countries, you may have to do some things that you otherwise might not want to do. In addition to the tax issues and the customs and duty regulations, there often are other regulatory requirements that specifically address the need for local presence or local content in your products. In the previous slide, the respondent mentioned that he made a decision to do in-country final packaging of his product, something he likely otherwise would not have done. And this person's talking about the same types of local requirements and compliance with those requirements. But he also raises a significant issue that you have to always keep in mind. That is, very simply, if you build your supply chain network around compliance with all the different regulations and duties and taxes and so forth, you also need to factor in the risk that's related to those decisions. Since those policies on taxes, duties, etc., they're subject to change at any moment. And I think this is a risk that is frequently overlooked or ignored in making those decisions.
This next topic was another one that seemed to lurk in the background of a number of respondents' answers to our questions. But here someone came right out and stated their fears. Intellectual property is not protected outside the U.S. the same way that it is inside the U.S. And so we're seeing supply chain designs need to change if you plan to take that supply chain into a low intellectual property protecting market. The way this company has done it is by separating things out so that no one has all the pieces to the puzzle. And this allows many of the upsides of offshoring while designing in some structural elements to protect that intellectual property. With regard to competing in that global environment, we also had a number of respondents speak to their efforts to localize abroad. Not only localizing those product attributes and tastes and marketing to meet local population needs and desires, but also localizing that supply chain, the suppliers that you source from, the way that the production is accomplished, and localizing that distribution network. Now, some of this is for the reasons that Bix just covered, for sure, but we heard that firms aren't localizing solely for regulatory or competition reasons to get into those markets, but also because at times it just makes financial sense to the way they're running. As our respondents have gone global, though, they've also had to find ways to make it easier on their supply chain and that localized workforce we were just talking about. So companies are looking for processes to make it easier globally. Now, this company had a huge number of SKUs for basically the same product, and in every market they would design and print and package locally. And as they say in the quote, they ended up with a lot of non-performing inventory that was really dragging them down. So what did they do? Well, they implemented a set of web tools, a common place for everyone in each of the global markets to come in and to design their packaging to a common standard while still allowing them the ability to print that packaging out and actually perform the final packaging of the product in the local market in an effort to keep those costs down. And this allowed them to maintain a consistent brand image, but at a reduced cost for the overall system, especially that system-wide inventory, which they were able to bring down. And then lastly, we heard about this from fewer folks, but it was still a bit of an issue, a significant one, and that's about touch point reduction. Now, lean is obviously based on this basic concept, but once globalizing, especially when localizing in each of those markets, we're hearing people talk about the value of touch point reduction to the business, especially with that localized workforce. So I'm going to pass it back to Bix now, and he's going to talk to you about mergers and acquisitions.
In a lot of our interviews, when the discussion turned to growth of the organization, merger and acquisition activity immediately came up as a topic of discussion. It seems that a lot of firms have decided that the best way to gain the knowledge and the people, as well as cope with regulatory issues as they move globally, is to acquire those things rather than grow their own. Now, growing through merger and acquisition also brings with it the challenges in terms of acquiring different processes, different practices, and different systems. And while these differences do exist in the domestic mergers and acquisitions, they tend to be a lot more extreme when it occurs as a part of a globalization effort. So there's the need for product and process simplification and standardization that Stan was talking about. It raises its head again when we talk about mergers and acquisitions. So yes, they add complexity, but they also offer the opportunity to acquire new best practices as well. So let's turn our attention now to the third major theme of today's discussion. It's a subject that I personally am very excited about, as we found several companies taking new approaches to try to really understand the true nature of cost in their supply chains. There are also some ways they're trying to reduce cost. Some of them are simply extensions of past trends and approaches, but others that provide evidence of creative thinking about supply chain management. For quite a few years now, there's been a lot of discussion in supply chain management about the need for better understanding of system-wide cost. Related to this discussion is the problem that cost data, as needed for the purposes of making good supply chain decisions, is not available from the traditional financial accounting systems. These traditional systems exist for the purpose of reporting financial results to the investment community, to shareholders, and to the government. There are strict rules to be followed in this reporting, and those rules are known as GAAP, which is an acronym for Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. Now, in following these principles, cost and expenses are classified into what are called natural accounts and functional accounts. But it's really too difficult to relate these classifications to specific products, to specific customers, or to specific suppliers, or other ways that managers need them to understand what is really driving the cost in the organization. So they end up trying to find ways to allocate cost, but they have to make arbitrary assumptions that ultimately result in a lot of distortion of cost data. Furthermore, most supply chain executives felt there's little they can do about this, since accounting is not their area of expertise. So the first two quotes I have are from the same person in one organization. Most of his supply chain partners live in the GAAP world, and so they have a lot of difficulty understanding his view of cost, because he's worked with the CFO in his company to implement a non-GAAP, more managerial approach in the company, and that allows him to make better operational decisions. This approach avoids the unnecessary allocations that most companies use, and it focuses on the revenue and the costs that are variable and the costs that are directly related to throughput, whether that be throughput of a product or a product category, throughput to a specific customer, or throughput related to some other segment of the business. And so he's able to much more easily relate decisions to the financial impact of those decisions. This third quote's a similar sentiment from another respondent, who even went so far as to express the thought that the GAAP approach could be scrapped or abandoned in his organization. Well, that's not really going to happen anytime soon, because government requirements for financial reporting really aren't going to be abandoned anytime soon. But it's refreshing to see and provides me with a lot of hope that supply chain executives are beginning to make some headway and working with accounting and finance functions to get more accurate information that helps them have a better understanding of cost and cost behavior. Traditional GAAP-based accounting won't give you what you need, but you can develop the tools to do so. So now let's turn our attention to some of the things being done in organizations to try to reduce costs. Now I'll note here that these are not the only things that are going on. There are a lot of other things going on to reduce costs that are more related to specific supply chain activities, and those will be covered in future webinars. I'll also note that some of these observations, such as automation, aren't really new, but they're worth looking at and discussing again. So in terms of using automation to reduce cost, the interesting thing I thought in this particular quote is that the respondent first mentioned that his company was no longer going to play the game of trying to always produce in the country with the lower labor cost. Since playing that game, the country with the lowest labor cost is always a moving target. You know, the company's decided that the best thing to do to keep labor costs low is to bring in automation. And related to that, if he's going to automate, he's going to bring manufacturing back domestically and reduce the impact of labor costs with this automation. I'm not sure a lot of firms have really thought about labor costs that particular way. And I think this is another interesting observation about labor and automation. Not that it's a surprise that it's being done to reduce cost, but I like to focus on the last part of the quote, which really reflects a genuine concern of the impact of automation on the labor and the people who have been involved. I thought it was refreshing to see that that is a concern in his company. In terms of information technology and cost reduction, the really interesting thing to me about this respondent is he didn't verbalize concerns about GAAP or traditional financial accounting, but that's actually what he's referring to. Because the heart of all ERP systems is a gigantic general ledger, which accumulates massive amounts of data in a traditional financial accounting approach. A lot of supply chain executives actually believed that ERP implementation would solve all of their problems in getting good cost information, and they were sorely disappointed. So they either have to do as this firm has done and develop their own applications to help, or they have to continue to live in the traditional financial costing world. One of the ways companies are trying to reduce supply chain cost is by working closer with suppliers and customers in a collaborative relationship. This should sound pretty familiar, as Stan spent his first several minutes talking about collaboration. But one of the points is that the focus in many collaborative arrangements is on cost and cost reduction. So this first respondent talked extensively about the notion of, in the old days, they used to just go to suppliers and pound his fist on the table and say, I need a cost reduction. But he now realizes that it's much more about understanding his own costs and understanding the supplier's costs as what's driving those costs. So they work together with suppliers on a strategic level to reduce cost rather than just demanding that the supplier give a cost reduction. This is a similar thought from the standpoint that if a supplier can reduce cost for the customer, then the supplier ought to be able to get better margins as well. If both companies are investing in cost reduction, both companies should be able to benefit from it. This is a similar sentiment, but it's working with customers instead of suppliers. Where in this company, the company has approached its two largest retail customers and its largest wholesale customers to work together collaboratively to improve results for both companies. Remember Stan's reference to the fact that you can't collaborate with everyone, but when you do collaborate, it's a win-win, and the benefits should accrue to both parties. The idea of system-wide cost and collaboration aren't just external approaches. They can be taken internally in an organization as well. This first quote directly raises the point that if you just shift costs from one function to another inside the organization, you can make some really bad decisions that end up hurting the company as a whole. And what I really like about this respondent's attitude, that he recognizes the potential for conflict between the functions in the company. But he concludes that you need to do whatever's best for the company as a whole. And basically, sometimes your function may have to, quote, take one for the team. And I think that's a very refreshing approach, and one that more supply chain executives are going to have to understand. Finally, as we're getting close to the end of our time here, I do want to point out that the research in the Beyond the Horizons project is not simply focused on supply chain cost and efficiency. The concern and the things we've uncovered extend far beyond that. But just to set your mind at ease that we're not focusing just on cost. Three very simple little quotes. From one respondent, we truly do make our decisions based on cost and serviceability, and suggest that long-term relationships, we're not going to switch out year after year just because somebody's going to give us a cheaper price. The second quote, notice that the primary focus is on quality and time. Price and cost are secondary importance. And finally, notice that what really matters in supply chain management is our customer and what the customer values. And what the customer values is not necessarily going to be cost or supply chain efficiency.
Okay, thanks, Bix. So that's a whole lot of information you've seen. We've shared with you a lot of what our different respondents said and tried to kind of frame some takeaways from that. What we've done, though, is we kind of pulled things together here into our three different categories: collaboration, globalization, and costing. We just kind of want to walk back through some of those major takeaways that we think you probably can take from this, and looking forward how you might consider this in operations in your supply chain. And so the first of these, I'll talk a little bit about collaboration and then pass it over to Bix to talk about some globalization stuff. But in the collaboration space, one of the first things we saw, as you see there in the bullet, is collaboration is more than just passing information between supply chain partners. It's easy to begin declaring successes in these cases where we've begun to share information that maybe was not shared in the past. But as you saw in those three different quotes that we had, there was kind of an evolution among those three respondents. And the reason we picked them, from the most basic of I'm going to give them this data so that they can have things here on time, into I'm going to give them this data so they can be able to plan ahead so that they can reduce their costs, on into the much richer, if we work together, we can get to a win-win. And we hope that that's the level that you're able to start to approach, is how do we get to that win-win? How do we share enough information and feel confident in sharing that with our supply chain partners that we can actually start to both have some benefit to come out of this? The second of the takeaways in the collaboration area is that you've got to work to be that customer of choice. We're very used to hearing about trying to become a supplier of choice. You need to take some of those same types of ideas and kind of take it front to back and think about, how do I make it easier for my suppliers so that when I am their customer, they're more willing to work with me. If they've got, as one of them said, if they've got one roll of steel left, I want to be the person, even though I may not be their biggest customer, it's possible I'm not even their most profitable customer, but I'm easy to work with. They care about my organization. I care about theirs. And so how do you take that and become that customer of choice above and beyond simple things like I pay my bills on time and I'm not a pain in the neck? And so another important takeaway. And the third in this collaboration space is this idea we saw with 2 or 3 of the different respondents talking about letting your suppliers shine. In particular, the point here was we often get into a mode where we direct that supplier on exactly what they need to provide to make us happy as a customer, and we may close ourselves off to some opportunities that that supplier has in improving our operations, the final product or service that our supply chain is designed around producing. And so bring them in early enough. We talked about early involvement of suppliers. Bring them in early enough to where they can see what the outcomes you're looking for are, what the goals are, and let them contribute at a stage when they can have a little bit more influence than just implementing the design of the product or process that you are going to them to outsource for. And so be that good customer and let that supplier bring their expert capability to the table.
As we moved into the discussion on globalization, one of the first things that we looked at and talked about is taxes, not only domestic tax structures, but tax structures in countries around the world. One of the things we've observed from several of our respondents is those tax issues are really driving a lot of the network decisions that they end up making, and a lot of the operational decisions that they end up making. Recall the respondent who makes product in one country, then ships that product to their home country, and then ships it back to the country where it was originally manufactured. So these tax issues are really driving a lot of the decisions that we're making in supply chain. We also found that it's not just taxes. There are other kinds of regulations with duties and compliance issues and customs. And well, decisions we make in supply chain management that are driven by those kinds of issues, well, they're subject to change in the future because those kinds of regulations themselves are subject to change. And so we may make a decision today that seems perfectly rational in keeping in compliance and keeping in compliance with those regulations, but there's a lot of risk that we're taking and adding on in our organizations as we make our decisions based on those factors.
Right. One of the other things that we also talked about was complexity, and how almost by definition, as you broaden your supply chain to have a global perspective, you're going to introduce additional markets and regulation, things like Bix was just talking about, and that as that supply chain gets more complex, you're going to need to spend some effort on trying to find ways to simplify in the supply chain. So we talked about touch point reduction and a few other different things. The important takeaway from that is as you globalize your supply chain, there's going to need to be some effort, and think about distributed execution. Whenever we start to distribute the execution across that supply chain, we need to do some things to try and bring that complexity down to a manageable level so that day to day, with the tempo that we have, we're able to keep control over that system.
And finally, as we were talking about globalization, we saw that a lot of the growth that companies are achieving comes about through mergers and acquisitions. And these mergers and acquisitions, as noted, do increase the complexity in our supply chains, but it also present opportunities for us to perhaps access new best practices from those firms that have been acquired or merged into our own organization. And finally, we turn to this discussion of costing and cost issues. And I spent a fair amount of time talking about supply chain and dealing with the traditional financial gap-based accounting and how that makes our system-wide decisions a whole lot more difficult. But I was pleased to see that at least 2 of the companies we've interviewed have made significant progress by working with their accounting people to implement managerial accounting standards that allow them to really understand the system-wide trade-offs that are involved. We also know that the total cost perspective, that we're really talking about trying to reduce total cost in the supply chain. That requires a broader view than just your own firm's cost. It requires that you work with your suppliers to understand their cost structures, to see what things you might be able to do to take costs out of their systems as they operate and deal with you. We also talked about working with customers, again, to understand their cost structures so that we can see where total cost can be taken out of the system. And we also noted that when we do these things, if we are working collaboratively with our supply chain partners, we have to be willing to share the benefits with them and not just try to capture those benefits for ourselves. And finally, we concluded with something that we thought was important since we've been talking about cost so much. Supply chain management is not only about cost and cost reduction. Ultimately, it's about what can we do to create value for the final customer of our firm's products or services. As we mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, the Beyond the Horizons research is an ongoing effort between Michigan State and APICS, and there are still many opportunities for you to participate both in the research or in further educational efforts that we're undertaking. First, there's some upcoming webinars that will be held in September and November. Specific dates have not been established, but one of those webinars will deal with the topic of talent management, and the other will take a deep dive into the world of procurement.
Also, as part of the output coming out of the research is a workshop or a series of workshops that are coming up. The first of those has actually been scheduled. It'll be at Michigan State University on August 24th and 25th, and it will look across the entire research. So it's a whole day-long event, and so much broader than today's webinar. It will have a little bit of content from a lot of different places, and so you can go to APEX's website to get more information about that upcoming workshop, as well as Michigan State's website. In the future, we've got 2 more workshops that are planned, one in October of this year in Chicago, and then in January of 2016 at a location still to be determined.
Furthermore, there have already been a couple of white papers that have been published and are available through APICS, and there will be additional white papers becoming available in September and then later in November of this year.
As well as the APICS magazine, there have been articles beginning to appear from the Beyond the Horizon research there. There's one about to come out very soon, and then in the September to October and November to December timeframe, you'll also see more information in the APICS magazine about that. As it relates to other opportunities to participate, like Bix mentioned, there are still chances to be a part of the research study as far as guiding what the findings are of this. The first of those is a survey which we are just putting the finishing notes on right now, which we will start to be contacting companies about answering. And so if you're interested in participating in that type of a survey, we'll have our contact information here for you again in a moment. Just want to let you know that that is out there as an opportunity, as well as.
In addition, we're going to be doing several in-depth case studies with selected organizations. Those will be starting very soon, and if you would like to perhaps be included as one of the case study organizations, please let us know.
As we've mentioned throughout, we're open to some discussion with you as it relates to the research. We've put back up, this is the email that's the general email for the overall research team. You've got Bix's and my information on a previous pair of slides early on. But if you wanted to get in touch with the research team as a whole, we've set up this email address here in-house, and so all you need to do is just go ahead and drop a note to that. Let us know what you're thinking or asking about, and we will make sure that someone gets back with you.
Thank you, Stan and Bix. And now we've saved some time for questions and answers. As a reminder, type your question in the questions box at the right-hand side of your screen and click send. We'll now give you a few moments to send in your questions.
Okay, folks, questions are starting to come in. We have a few that we, as we were going through the webinar, recording off to the side, and so what we thought we would do is kind of try and answer those in groups, if you will. At times we've got folks asking pretty similar questions, and so Bix and I are trying to keep track of all this, and so what we'll do is kind of address them in pockets. So the ideas of what some of the already in questions are, we hope will get answered. And if not, go ahead and keep putting things up there. But the first one I'm going to go ahead and address, and that was, we had a number of folks asking about the participants. And as we mentioned kind of in passing on the front of the presentation, we did have 50 companies from 6 continents. If you were wondering why we didn't start naming names, that's really kind of part of the agreement we had with the companies up front, that they would really open themselves up to us under the realization that we would not specifically name names, if you will. When the further publications begin coming out, you will start seeing some of the names, because we're going to vet some of those questions through those companies, and if there are not questions, some of the issues through companies, and so they may be allowing us to use their names in the future. But basically what we've got is we had manufacturers, we had retailers, we had service providers, and some of the industries that those companies were in is in healthcare, aerospace, technology, apparel, food, consumer packaged goods, oil and gas. And quite frankly, if you opened up the Wall Street Journal and looked through a lot of the companies you see there, many of those are people that we did talk with. So
we had several questions revolving around the whole issue of on what basis do you choose a supplier or a supply chain partner to collaborate with. Questions worded slightly different, but I think several fell into that general category. Basically, I wish there was one simple answer to that question, but basically what I'd say is you take a look at the supply base, for example, and what are the really critical products or services that you buy, and as opposed to the routine purchases that you make, and think about what's the potential benefit of collaborating with a specific supplier in that space. Is there a tremendous opportunity for cost reduction? For example, in a routine purchase, if there is a tremendous opportunity with a particular supplier for cost reduction, then that might be a supplier you choose. Or on more strategic parts or pieces or things that you buy, and think about what is the benefit of collaborating with a particular supplier versus what's the risk that you're going to be incurring.
A couple of other little housekeeping ones that I see coming up as Bix was talking. We've had a number of folks ask about the copies of the PowerPoints. Bix can make those available to you. I think at the end of this there's going to be another announcement about how you would go about accomplishing that. The other question that has come up from a few different folks is if you wanted to look at this later, will this be archived on Apex's server? My understanding is, and Jennifer will cover it with us at the end, I think, again, but I think next week they will have that available. So for those that are asking those questions, Apex can take care of that. The next kind of a group of questions that came in that I want to talk just a little bit about had to do with the, if you will, intricacies of relationships in the supply chain and collaboration, in particular, something that in the research space we often talk about as triads. So let's say that my supplier is also one of my competitors. That can be a bit of a challenge when you're buying inputs to your process or product from someone who may or may not be a competitor at a present time or at a future point in time. Similarly, triads often get into an area where maybe company A and company B, who are competitors, both have a common supplier, and there is concern as to leakage, if you will, of information across that gap. And so in any of these different triadic type of relationships, collaboration, as some of your questions have asked, seems like it would become quite a bit trickier, and that's actually the case. Your gut feel on that is accurate. And so the question said, well, how do we deal with this? And there's really at least 3 or 4 different ways that typically this is handled. The first of them is a strong non-disclosure agreement. Now, we're all very familiar with those. But even with those, maybe we're not always completely confident. Maybe they won't disclose it to someone else, but if it's the supplier who might become a competitor at a later point in time, they don't have to disclose that information to anyone else to benefit from it in moving their business forward and maybe creating issues for us at a future time. And so a strong NDA doesn't always handle that issue. The next thing that you can do is compartmentalize, and we kind of saw that in one of the examples where a company was talking about when I was talking in the collaboration space about not letting one supplier really see the entire process. And so another way to deal with that issue is to ensure that a supplier that you were concerned might be learning out of your relationship and either doing something with that information for themselves or for your competitors, you may need to work to prevent them from seeing the entire picture, if you will. One of the other things that you often see with this is really considering whether or not that needs to be a collaboration. Maybe this is a supplier or a customer that you're going to need to move to more of an arm's length type of relationship so that there's less deep and, if you will, intimate information passing across the dyad. And so that's going to bring with it some reduced benefits, probably to both players, but if that supply chain partner is benefiting much more than you are out of that, then it may be time to consider that that isn't going to be as collaborative a relationship. And then the last one, and we've seen this with companies like Apple that buys chips from any number of companies that it is also, as well as displays, that it is a competitor with. We've seen them very visibly working to develop a broader supply base so that they don't have to continue to not prop up, but build the capabilities of some of those competitors that later become a problem for them in the marketplace. And so those are at least 4 different ways that that you can look at that. And really the underlying thing under all that is trust. And so making sure that you're building trust, and I'm not suggesting that it's easy, but the ways that you can build trust into that relationship, shared destinies, if you will, then they start to understand that if I go wrong in this, it's going to really negatively affect me, the offending party, in a more dramatic way.
We also had several questions on the topic of GAAP and cost accounting and the traditional financial accounting versus managerial accounting. And frankly, I would love to spend the next 3 or 4 hours discussing that topic with you. Unfortunately, time won't allow us to do that. I can tell you that there will be a lot of discussion of that at our upcoming workshop session in on August 25th and 26th here at Michigan State.
24th and
25th.
Sorry about that.
Thank you, Stan, for that correction. But I also tell you that if you want to send me an email at the address that was shown earlier, or simply at cooperm@msu.edu, I'll do my best to provide you with a little more information.
And so a couple more questions that have come in while we've been answering your questions. One of them is about the data itself. A number of folks have asked if there is quantitative data on top of the qualitative data. There is some, but the next phase of this research actually is going to involve a survey where we're going to, given what we've learned so far through the qualitative analysis, and another question asked, what do we use for software? We used Atlas TI for the person that asked that question. But what we're in the middle of doing right now is actually developing a survey to go back out to APICS membership. If you're interested in seeing what that looks like, again, please feel free to contact us through the emails you have. But that's going to go in, and again, we're going to protect the identities of companies and not reveal who anyone is, but it's going to give us that quantitative data to start to look for some statistical relationships between an independent and a dependent variable without going too deeply into the pointy-headed academic nature of that. But as far as one of the other questions that's come up from a number of folks, folks have asked about reshoring and what does the future of production in the United States look like. Bix, I don't know if you want to jump in, but I mean, we see more and more of that from the companies that we were talking with. As labor costs have, moved around the Pacific Rim from one region to another to the lowest cost, we are starting to see more of what, Bix, I think you call it, what, right shoring?
Yeah, but it's not necessarily coming back to the home country, but certainly a much different look at the total network and the total cost to make sure we're doing it in the right place as opposed to necessarily the lowest labor cost country.
And so as we were talking with companies, we're seeing that the total cost is really starting to drive that question a lot more than maybe the initial push into a lot of markets really did. And so as we've been talking with them, we're seeing more and more, and it really butts up against Bix's discussion of the gap accounting. As folks are getting a better understanding of what their true costing looks like, they're recognizing that, I can bring things back to the United States. One of the issues, or the Americas, if you will, one of the quotes that we actually did not include was one of a large, I'll call them a manufacturer and leave out what it is that they manufacture. But they talked about how they had started to pull back manufacturing from around the globe to bring that someplace closer so that the product lines aren't on the water for quite as long. And one of the issues that was a little concerning to see was a discussion from them about the importance of automation in that process. And so for those of you running the businesses, we think you're going to see more stuff closer to home, wherever home might be. But for our workers, it's a bit of a concern probably, because as we've seen coming out of the last recession, a lot of businesses have invested in equipment and those type of capital assets rather than manpower. And we were seeing that at least 2 different companies that we spoke to out of the 50 said, we're moving some more of that stuff back. But as we're doing that, we're doing it in a, if you will, higher tech kind of a way, and we're not investing as much in people. So let's see, I'm looking at the clock here to see how much time we have left. We've got about 5 minutes. One of the things that you see up on the screen that's just popped up, we've talked about this just in passing a couple of different times, but the slide that is up there right now, we're going to be able to dive deeper into these issues. There's a 2-day event sponsored by APICS and Michigan State University for this project. The details are listed there. Space is somewhat limited, so if you are interested in that, please do go check that web address and get a little bit deeper dive into what that looks like, the things that we're going to be covering there. Obviously, today's webinar, we're able to cover about an hour's worth of material, but in that we'll have quite a bit more time. As far as other questions, we're scrolling down here. We got a couple of minutes. Got a number of you saying thank you. We appreciate the notes. Thank you. We like to hear that. Got a couple here about Africa. We did gather some data in Africa. What we are seeing there is that companies are very, very interested in Africa from both a supply and a demand perspective. Obviously, there's a huge population in Africa that's growing in its wealth, and so we're seeing companies starting to dip their toe into that market. We're also seeing that people are interested in them as a market for production. Some of those are some of the tariff and regulation reasons that Bix mentioned earlier, but we are seeing more and more companies that we aren't commonly expecting to see in the African market starting to learn how to go into that market, because it's really a huge population base that continues to grow in affluence, and so from both the supply side of the supply chain, as far as resources as well as people and manufacturing, on over to the demand side, we're seeing more and more of that from some of the companies we were talking with. So, Jennifer, do you have anything else that you wanted to cover before our time runs out?
Yes, a couple more things. So thanks everyone for participating. If you have any more questions that weren't answered, please feel free to reach out to Stan or Bix directly. Or you can email editorial@apix.org, which you can email if you want to ask more questions, which we can forward to Stan and Bix for you. Or if you want copies of the slides, do contact us there, and we'd be happy to help you out. And so in closing, I'd like to thank our presenters for their time today, and all of you for watching this APIX webinar. All content and materials included in this edition of the APIX webinar are the property of APIX and Michigan State University and are protected by the United States and international copyright laws. All rights are reserved. Thanks so much, everyone, for watching.